Hello, thank you very much for being here. I am Julieta Aranda. I am the organizer of the Conversations series at Art Basel since this year. And it is a great pleasure to introduce this panel now, which is the Art Market Talk, is Mind the Gap, and by that we mean Mind the Price Gap. It's a gender thing. To give you a sense of what the panel is about, I read you something. It's art by women continues to be undervalued. As a study by researchers at the Luxembourg School of Finance revealed in 2017. In response to the underrepresentation of female artists, several institutions and galleries have organized women-only shows. While these exhibitions certainly allow for exposure and fill an art historical gap, do they actually have an impact on the market value of female artists? This panel aims to address these questions by bringing together experts in the field. Have these shows impacted the prices of works by female artists? To what extent has the behavior of collectors toward female artists changed? And what else can be done to overcome the gender price gap? We have Jen Daly as a moderator. She is an arts editor of the Financial Times in London. And our panelists are Valeria Napoleone, an art collector and philanthropist based in London. Candice Breitz, an artist and loudmouth and extraordinaire based in Berlin. And Susanne, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, Vielmetter, founder of Susanne Vielmetter Los Angeles projects in Los Angeles. And having said this, please take the floor.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to what I hope will be a really interesting discussion. We've only got an hour, but we will give the audience some time to put questions and discuss. I have with me, I'm Jan Daly, I'm the arts editor of the Financial Times, and I've got a really amazing panel here. Valeria Napoleone, a collector who specializes in women's art. She'll tell you more about that. She's not only a collector, but also a philanthropist who has just been awarded the Mont Blanc Arts Patronage Award for 2019 for her work with the Arts Fund, with her XX project, XX being the chromosomes, right?
Female chromosome.
Exactly.
Partnership.
Yes. Artist Candice Breitz and gallerist Susanne. Is it Vielmetter? Vielmetter. I didn't know if it was Ville or Val. So also from Los Angeles, Candice is originally from South Africa, but now based in Berlin, and Valeria is London-based. So we're covering the world a little bit as well as covering the art world. I wanted to start by giving you just a few little facts and figures. I promise you they won't be boring because they'll be really, really quick. I don't think it'll be any surprise for you to learn that the paper from the University of Luxembourg, which was just mentioned, 2017 research, showed an average price gap between men's work and women's work of 47.6%, i.e., it's almost half. If we think that's improving, then actually the UBS Art Basel Art Market Report for last year, 2018, they found that what they politely call the gender discount, I'm not sure it's really a discount, but anyway, the gender discount, as they call it, in paintings is almost 50%. So that's roughly where it is. But there is, before I turn it over to our panel, I want to tell you something else that the University of Luxembourg study did, which I think is fascinating. 2,000 people were shown computer-generated paintings. You know this work, do you? Randomly assigned fictitious artist names. In other words, some of them were given clearly male names, some of them were given clearly female names. It was all fictional because they were all made randomly by machine. And then 2,000 people were asked to rate them in terms of aesthetic value and monetary value. And guess what? It was almost exactly as you might have predicted. The works that were assigned clearly female artists' names were ranked lower in aesthetic value and lower in monetary value, dramatically lower. So that's where we are. Here we are now in the middle of this fantastic fair with a great deal of women's work on show. Also, many women exhibitors, which is another issue I hope we'll talk about. So I think I'll start without more ado with Valeria and ask her to speak about it a little bit from her point of view. Collecting women's art, philanthropy for supporting women's artists, the gender price gap.
Wow, that's a lot. I'll start saying that I've been collecting for 20 plus years, since 1997. I was born as a collector in New York, were magical time then. And since the very beginning, I focused the collection on female artists. It was not an agenda. It was really something coming probably from my heart, very organically. And I have been collecting since then. I collect, but also I support artists in many other ways. In 2015, I started this XX, which is an initiative that supports female representation in museums and in exhibition spaces, and that's the Mont Blanc Award 2019. My collection is about quality. It's not about giving support to these poor women, otherwise they would not be having a chance. Great art will have a chance. It will take longer, but will have a chance. So it's about the quality of artists that I include in the collection, that I support in many other ways. There are many artists I don't include because I don't like the work, I don't respond to the work, because I arrive late in the game. But quality is essential. So we are not saying every artwork by a female artist is good. We are saying there is so much quality that we are ignoring because of gender, and I couldn't understand why when I started collecting. Why just because is a female artist, we are dismissing the work. Yes.
Thank you. Candice, I've heard it said that one of the reasons for the gender price gap, I'm not going to call it a discount, I can't believe, I did write that down, it's not a discount. The gender price gap is that it is still the case that the majority of buyers and collectors are male, and it's the men who undervalue the women artists. Has that been your experience?
Well, I'd like to answer that question, but before I do, I will thank Julieta for inviting us and Annelie for welcoming us. And I'd like to say that I'm slightly ambivalent about being here today, as much as it's a wonderful opportunity to speak about questions that are very close to my heart. Today coincides with an annual event which takes place in Switzerland, and that is the Swiss Women's Strike. And it's a day which acknowledges and strives to fight against the gender pay gap within the Swiss economy. Women earn 20% less than men for doing the same work in Switzerland. And so theoretically, those of us who feel that this needs to change as women should not be sitting here. We should be on strike. This is a form of labor that we're doing here. However, in weighing up this opportunity and knowing how hard it has been until very recently to acquire visibility for these questions, I'm here. And I'd like to start by saying that as important as it is to me for us to address gender inequity, I'm not convinced that we can do that meaningfully in excluding other categories of exclusion. And what I mean by that is that the violence that is done, the violence of exclusion that is performed by patriarchy, has an effect on other people too, not only women. And I think that there's a very, very close relationship between white supremacy and patriarchy. And it's not really possible to speak about the exclusion of women from representation and visibility without considering the different ways in which that affects different women. I was shocked to read in a recent survey that the Museum of Modern Art only has 11% of the artists in the collection are women. Far more shocking to me was the fact that 1% of artists in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art are black women. In a country where black women make up 20% of the population. And I think that somehow when we speak about forms of exclusion, there's a danger in kind of reducing the conversation to gender only. I know that that's our focus for today, but I wanted to make the point. And to come back to your opening question, yes, we know that those who are in power, whether that means in positions of political power or positions of economic power, are the ones who determine so-called quality. So invariably, when you start a conversation about disparity and inequity, which I prefer to refer to as discrimination, another word which, like discount, starts with dis, these forms of discrimination are guaranteed by the fact that most of the powerful institutions that we operate within and are subject to are run by men. Most of the buying power in the market is in the hands of men. And certainly at the top level, although there are many amazing women gallerists around, the higher up you go in the ecosystem, the more likely it is that there will be a man owning the gallery. And as Susanne pointed out to me in conversation before, when we were preparing for this talk, the more affluent and the more powerful a gallery is, the fewer women they are likely to represent. This is statistically true. So I think that, you know, there's nothing very tempting about giving up privilege. When you're in a position of privilege and power, you're not particularly likely to be wanting to give that privilege up. And for as long as the decision makers and those with the fattest wallets are men, these kinds of inequities will be perpetuated, I think.
Well, I think also it's not just the market. I think we need to give responsibility and pressure to museums, to curators and directors of museums, because yes, the market dictates a lot, but let's not forget that, you know, without museum representing artists or showing artists, the market cannot do that much, because also the prices are totally in relationship, they should be at least, to museum exhibitions and exhibitions in exhibition spaces. So the curriculum vitae of an artist is really linked to museum. And so often, we know the story, right? Director of museum mount incredibly ambitious exhibitions. They need money, and younger galleries, smaller galleries don't have that much money, and they turn into the biggest gallery who, according to the art newspaper a while ago, 80% of the artists they show in Europe are by artists from 5 galleries. That was a while ago. So I really think that if institutions do an incredible job in addressing this, then the market will come. I mean, it will take a long time, but...
I would like to add something to the issue of quality that Candice brought up. And there's a very common narrative when you address the issue with just your average collector, you know, and you bring the issue up. Why do you have so many male artists in your collection, or why are you... I like to sometimes ask, is there a particular reason why 99% of your collection is by male artists? Because from my perspective, that strikes me as somewhat odd. And very often the response is, well, we are really kind of gender blind. We really like, our collection is really focused on quality. We simply, collect the best. And I think it is useful in this context to kind of think that through a little bit, and to realize that neither the definition of an artwork lies within this artwork. Like this glass of water can either be a glass of water or it can be an artwork, and it will be an artwork if the artist declares it an artwork. So it's something that is defined by an artist and by a group of people who look at this work and all come to an agreement that this is now an artwork. The same is true for quality. Quality is not inherent in the work. As disappointing as this might sound for a moment, there is no objective criterion to value the degree of quality, and therefore to value the degree of actual monetary value within the work. It's something that we agree on, and this agreement is justified because there are, we have critics, we have gallerists, we have museums, and they all come to an agreement about this value of this work. Now, if you have the critic, the collector, the artist, the museum curator, all from the same small cultural group, is it any surprise that only members from this same small cultural group make great work? No, that's how this whole spiel kind of functions. So it's actually, if you look at the art world and the art market from a purely market smart kind of point of view, it's actually incredibly amazing that so many white male artists are valued at the value that they have right now, because it goes actually against all rules of markets. Usually, when you talk about a market, people are of the opinion that if you diversify the market, if you reach out to new clients, if you reach out to a more diverse clientship, that you're doing something that actually increases your market and your market value. None of this is happening in the art world, or actually it's happening just a tiny little bit right now. But for many, many years, the art world has actually worked in the exact opposite way. And the whole idea that you reach out to a larger group of customers, that you widen your horizon, that you actually have a more interesting cultural dialogue, that has not happened in the past. We are right now at the brink of a moment where this is actually sinking in and where there's a little bit of a change happening. And I'm very happy about that, but we're far away from any kind of even remote notion of a fair and balanced or, equal situation for...
Well, I hope that we're going to have some time to talk about how we might work a bit further towards that equality. But what you've been saying does bring up something which I'm quite interested in. Do we think that there is some kind of identifiable female aesthetic which is a defining, well, not defining, but that there is an actually specific aesthetic or difference in content, difference. There is certainly a difference in subject matter. This also applies to minority ethnic groups. So actually, what the art in fact contains sometimes is quite different. Do we think that this has had an effect? I mean, is it something?
I completely disagree.
Oh, good.
And I think it's a mistake to. Of course, we're all determined by who we are and where we're born and what our experience of the world is, and that seeps through into our work as artists. But I think that this has been very much a trap for artists who are not white men. The expectation that you will represent that which you are, which is not white maleness. I mean, I'll be honest and I'll say this is the second time I've had the pleasure of being invited to speak at Art Basel Conversations. The first time that I was invited as an African artist to talk about what it means, which of course is highly ironic because I'm a white South African artist. The second time today, I'm here to speak as a woman. One day I may be invited to speak as an artist. We bear the burden of representation when we are not white men. And I know from speaking to many friends of color who make compelling work of very diverse nature, whether it be a strict minimal abstraction or a work that chooses to engage questions of identity and experiences of race, that there is something utterly frustrating about the expectation that one will translate one's experience of identity into an aesthetic. I think that this needs to be a choice for all artists, and I think that this idea that there is an essential woman's work or African American work needs to be something which we fight to reject, because ultimately artists should have a freedom to work in the way that they choose. Yeah.
Couldn't agree more.
I actually have a lot of occasion people come into my collection and say, wow, but it doesn't look like a work made by a woman. And so I always ask, what do you mean? What do you have in mind? It looks like it's not pink, it's not embroidered, it's not kitchen tools. I mean, and people come with all sorts of expectations in their mind.
Good. Well, that was wonderful. I'm glad we got rid of that one. I was hoping that was what you were going to say. And it was really beautifully expressed. So just this year, we can see a change in the behavior of institutions, I think, across, well, at least across some of the big art capitals of the world. I think it's fair to say that even the biggest institutions are kind of wising up and becoming quite ashamed of themselves for their past behavior. And in the last 6 months, there's the most incredible number of extraordinary big solo shows by women in our most important institutions, which is absolutely wonderful, as long as it's not a quick blip and then we go back to how we were. So what is the mechanism by which this can feed back into a wider sort of equality in the thing? Susanne, from the point of view of a gallerist and the importance of getting women into big institutional shows and how that affects the market and all the rest, is that something that you...
Well, I think it all starts with awareness. And I, from my point of view, do think that the American institutions are probably just a tad ahead of the European institutions in realizing that there's a problem. It's, for instance, rarely seen now in an American institution that they would put up a group show of, let's say, 20 artists and all white male. Can still be seen here. But of course, we're not in really interesting territory yet. And the reason for that is that the biggest players in the field, the biggest galleries in the field, they are only beginning to see that if your program only contains 10 to 15% artists, female artists, you have a problem. that is just beginning to emerge. It has to do with the fact that from a gallerist's point of view, it is still not easy to run a gallery financially if you are aware of the problem and if you understand your program the way I do, not so much as, oh, you know, I simply show the best of the best, or I simply show what I like, or even worse, I simply show what my collectors like and sells. But if you have a understanding of a gallery as a cultural institution that actually lays the groundwork for a cultural program that, as it grows, transfers into what you see in a museum. That is really what we galleries do. We nurture artists, we nurture their careers, and eventually, hopefully, some of these artists will be seen in a museum which has a different cultural, hopefully, understanding, where the focus has to lie, in my opinion, much more on relevancy to an audience. So if you have an understanding of your gallery as something that has a responsibility in terms of reflecting a cultural output that's actually out there and not a highly filtered, selective cultural output of a few guys who have problems or issues, then it's difficult to make that financially work. It takes an everyday effort, and it takes a special understanding from collectors who are actually open to these issues, and who make an active effort to support this. I always say, collectors need to realize that what they do is political. Whether you want to be political
point.
or not, but if you collect art, the choices that you make will have a direct effect on the cultural output of your city or of your, you know, the place where you are active.
Well, this is one of the reasons why Valeria is so...
And you you actually have an influence on that cultural production. You have an indirect cultural influence of what your neighbor's kid sees in 10 years in their local museum, and whether they feel they're reflected in what this museum says about your time and your place or not.
Yeah, I'd like to strongly agree with you, Susanne, and to not move the conversation away from the market, but to agree with you that when we're talking about the market, we're talking also about building of archives and memories. And what museums do when they collect is they build repositories of our stories. And to have repositories that focus, you know, almost exclusively or to a radical extent on the stories of a relatively small, relatively homogeneous sector of who lives in our society is actually, to use a market term, tantamount to an immense impoverishment. We are accepting an incredible cultural impoverishment and poverty by perpetuating a situation in which so few voices get to be saved for the next generation and the generations to come. And that's where maybe I see an interesting segue for us to talk about possible strategies, because to some extent I think most of us in this room have thought about these questions and feel similarly about them. I'm sure that some of the people who need to be thinking about these things haven't bothered to come to this talk today. So I would like to say that in order to change things, some very radical measures need to be taken, and there needs to be some courage, because questioning power does not win you very many friends. In fact, it's a wonderful way to filter out the people who occupy your sort of social terrain and to sort of figure out who shares a similar view of the world to you. And I would like to say that I think that one of the radical examples which I admire greatly is something that the Baltimore Museum of Art has been doing. Some people may be aware of that, under the directorship of Chris Bedford, and I know that Kristen Heilman worked very hard on this, whereby the museum recently, rather controversially, deacquisitioned several works by major artists of the likes of Warhol and Rauschenberg. They were very methodical and careful in identifying which of these works they would deacquisition, and they identified the fact that several of these artists were overrepresented in the collection, and that some of their Warhols were stronger than other of their Warhols. Some of them had been gifted by collectors at a point in time where the museum wasn't very closely vetting gifts from collectors. And so that institution made the rather radical decision to deacquisition, I think it was 6 or 7 works, as a means of creating capital to add a number of works in the foreseeable future by women and artists of color. And so this was a relatively quick and relatively effective way, controversial, of course, of generating a resource whereby some correcting and some catching up could be done. Now, obviously, it's not possible to entirely revise centuries of exclusion and disparity, and that's an argument which I think receives far too much space when these kinds of conversations have been had. But the history. We need to be speaking about how we're acting in the present and how we're going to move forward in such a way that doesn't repeat what's happened in the past. So I offer the strategies that have been developed by the Baltimore Museum of Art as one possible way forward in terms of thinking in a visionary way. And I will also offer a negative example, because I'm not sure that I'm completely ready to celebrate this moment of change and transformation. We haven't yet lived through enough of it to know that it's going to be something which is continuous and which actually shifts the way that things happen. So when you look at an institution in Europe, as Susanne was saying, European institutions have been slower than Anglo-American institutions and South African institutions, if I may say so, in addressing these questions. The Wolfsburg Museum, where as of now I'm never going to show my work, is a collection which has only existed for 25 years. They started collecting in 1994. And this year they proudly put together an exhibition of works from their collection, the last 25 years, of which, and I don't want to get this wrong, because of which, give me a second, of which 75% of the works are made by men. This is a collection that was started in 1994. So I'd like to say that we have an opportunity now in this contemporary moment to move forward from historical mistakes and to think about what is possible now. And I'm interested, actually, rather than lamenting and complaining and analyzing, I believe that counting is an important feminist strategy, and I think we need to keep counting and pointing out. But I'm very interested in possible ways forward and possible bravery, not only from women and people of color and queer people who have acquired a platform, but from male allies and male feminists who happen to be in positions of power and who have the tools to actually change some of these dynamics.
Yeah, I think that's brilliantly said. Well, this is one of the reasons why Valeria is so extraordinary and pretty unusual, in fact. Do you talk to other women collectors or other collectors, male collectors, who are particularly interested in this issue? Or
I don't talk to other collectors. I don't have that many close friends who are collectors. I talk to curators and to galleries, to writers, artists. With XX and the initiative that in the UK gives every year a major piece by female artists to a regional museum, it's extraordinary what we find out, because we receive between 15 and 20 applications every year to receive this grant, which in their collection, and all of them, they have between 0 and 5% is the most, and they're lucky, % of women in the collection, and 0 budget. So in the UK, and we have all the files. So I'm very proud that we're building year by year a file of all these museums, and every year they're different. Now, what, for instance, we have decided and strategized into giving is not just a great work and this is it. There are so many criteria by which we decide which work goes into the collection, and I'm in the committee, but I don't decide. We have 4 people: the museum, the Contemporary Society head of acquisition, and the head of the Contemporary Society, and me. And out of, we're going to be at the 4th one, but we gave all artists that, in view also of Brexit, and we were really considering artists that are not UK-based, African American, South African, Mexican. So, but not just looking at that, but it came out that we wanted to give new voices. And we started with the first one, which was Martine Sims, a beautiful video by Martine. And I wanted really this community who are totally not exposed to contemporary art and are very isolated, to really be exposed to languages that come from across the pond and from other cultures. And so that's important, and this little one donation, it's not a little, but it's one donation, makes a huge difference to a variety of people in that community, young kids and older people, younger generation especially, and it's so important to inspire and with a gesture, and a gesture can go a long way. So I agree with you. I mean, it's not something that people tend to say, oh, we have now a whole female show. And this is a very, very dangerous thing to do, another all-female show. It's great to have the opportunity to expose them, but what about, we don't want to create a category, we want to create inclusion, we want to have, openness, we want to be in society, in the center of art, our production, our galleries, museums, and not being, she's good as a woman. So there is a lot to do, and one strategy is fantastic, I agree with you, but it's a lot in the hands of museum, and I agree with you in that. They have much more power than we expect. It is not the market. For me, it's even much more museums, because the market follows. If an artist has incredible shows in one of the biggest museums, the collectors will want to go after this. The market would give credibility to that.
Well, with that, as you mentioned earlier, more as the public funding is dwindling up for museums, there's more and more a situation where the museum cannot afford the catalog anymore. The museum very often cannot even afford to ship the works anymore. They can only show works that happen to be in collections in that same town. And so as the museums need more money to fund these shows, they have a tendency to go to artists who are represented by their most powerful galleries, who can easily write that $50,000 check to fund the show. So this is how these things are connected. I wanted to say something in that regard in how the market kind of functions into this. Is in Europe, I find, even though things are changing so fast and the European situation is becoming much more similar to the American situation. But in Europe, until very recently, I always had the impression that there was still more public funding there for museums, and there were also more financial resources available for artists in the form of grants or studio support so that they could sustain their practice without the market. In America, it's very different, very, very different. An artist cannot have a serious career without the market. The market makes it possible for an artist to pay for their studio, to pay for their canvas and stretchers and whatever it is they need to make the work, and to not only make that on that level, but to grow it. And this is where the galleries come in to make that possible and to provide a financial context in which this art-making process can take place. And the museums enter this whole conversation at a much later date. So we galleries, at least the galleries that represent emerging and mid-career artists, we do all the kind of, we make it possible that these artists even make it to the mid-career level when they become interesting for a museum interest.
I think that's a very good point. It's a very good description of the ecology, which is a very tight-knit circle. And I think as Candice says, we've talked about everything that's gone wrong with that, and then getting into every aspect of this cyclical ecosystem is really the way forward, isn't it? So we've described a magnificent institutional move. Sorry, did you say Baltimore?
The Baltimore Museum of Art.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
And then this other wonderful philanthropic one, which takes private philanthropy into the public sphere. Galleries as well. Artists themselves, of course, can, I think, do a great deal, partly by being very aware of what it means to have your work in certain places. I mean, you did just now quickly say there was somewhere you weren't ever going to show again.
As of today. that bridge is broke.
Yeah, that bridge is broke. But of course, you have to reach a certain level of self-sufficiency to be able to make that call.
And I'm glad you said that, because there is a direct relationship between the amount of visibility one has had or acquired. I've had a very privileged career, considering the fact that I grew up in Johannesburg, considering the fact that I'm a woman. I've been able to certainly benefit from being very middle class and very white. But I will say that being able to speak out and being able to shift things, it depends on the level of risk that you're able to take in relation to the privileges that have been dealt to you. And so I think that those of us who have the luxury of having acquired a platform or a little bit of visibility certainly have more responsibility to bear. And younger artists, or artists who are more at risk for whatever reason, because of their gendered experience of the world or their experience of the world in terms of race or other experiences, should not be expected to bear the same burden or to perform the same labor. We need to protect people who are at risk within the market, because when you speak out in a situation like this, you're alienating people. I've been very vocal about these questions, and I've earned myself a number of enemies, and I may or may not live to see that have an impact on my career, but I'm in a position to do that, and a lot of other artists are too, and it's exciting to see that more and more artists are willing to speak out rather than playing the game and floating down the river along with the benefits that accrue to having achieved a certain level of visibility.
I would like to say one thing to that too, and that what I mentioned earlier is value of an artwork is not objective. We all agree on it, meaning we all participate in this conversation. It takes a little mind switch to simply change it. There is no female art by female artists is not less valuable than art made by male artists, and the same is true for any cultural background. So we are the ones who are making this agreement, and because we're making it, it's not a physical law. It can be changed. So, but it does take some effort to make that kind of mind switch.
Make that switch.
And I want to add one thing. We need to also put pressure on education and school. That's where the future of curators and directors. I sit on the board of the Institute of Fine Arts in New York City, which is the master and the PhD school of NYU in curatorial studies, but in art history, it's an incredible institution. And there are so many women coming out from that school, and fantastic mentoring and education. We need to educate the future generation to this.
Well, I think on that note, we must give the audience a chance because we're going to run out of time. But please ask your questions. There's some roving mics. If you could put your hand up, a mic will come to you. And if you want to address one particular panelist particularly, say so. Here. First one here, please.
Thank you so much for bringing such an important and urgent topic to this market fair. And that is part of what I wanted to go back to, especially with Susanne. I really appreciated what you had to say about the politics of consensus around this concept of value. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you see that shifting in the current marketplace. From my perspective, being in the field for 20 years, I see a radical change. I think we've seen an incredible shift from time in the studio where artists were creating their own communities and that informing the community and the culture of the gallery, and that having time with very selected collectors, of which there weren't very many, and there was time for this politics of consensus. And now we have a very fast marketplace, and we have a little imbalance of power and the leverage of the museums who are dictating some of this idea of value. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about how you feel that's changed and if you feel there are some strategies that we can employ in this current ecosystem.
Absolutely.
Yes, strategies is what we want. Yes.
I do think there are several factors. One of which is our world is changing. And what people sometimes forget is that the idea of a female collector walking into a gallery who has earned her own money, that is such a radically new concept. You have to understand that hasn't been around in the last 2,000 years. We haven't had female collectors who are loaded, who actually make their own money. There's a great history of female collectors who have inherited, who were fortunate enough to spend the money of their fathers or their husbands. But the fact that powerful female collectors come and have an interest in art who have earned their own money, that's a brand new development that hasn't been around long, and hopefully we'll have more of this. That, of course, does not guarantee that this collector then also has a mission or even an agenda. And we cannot expect to collect female artists or to help female artists or even have an awareness. We cannot, and I think it's not fair to automatically expect that. I would hope that this would be there. Very often it's actually the opposite. So that's one thing that is dramatically changing, and I can say the same is true for African American collectors. You have a more diverse distribution of money, and that's happening right now, and that has an immediate effect. The other most important change that has happened is the development of the internet and the speed of communication, and with that, the access to a very large group of people who are very vocal in their opinions. It used to be there was a very, very small group of tastemakers and serious art critics, they're mostly all white male. They set the tone, and they had a disproportionately large voice in this value conversation. That has changed very recently, and I think it is a very welcome and great development, because it just it makes the whole discourse about what is important to whom, what is relevant right now, it makes it much richer and much more interesting, and I think there's a potential there to make it more fair. It doesn't always happen that way, but those two things I see as signs of hope. The rest is education. As I said, from a purely investment point of view, you'd be stupid to go. You'd be really a stupid investor to narrow your focus down to a tiny, tiny subfraction of something that you're collecting that is already a tiny subfraction of something else, of your portfolio. So that needs to arrive up here.
It's a good time to take advantage of the gender discount. Buy it while it's cheap. It won't stay cheap.
Right. Good investment
That's
opportunity.
a good one. Yeah. Is there another question? Sorry, I can't see you very well. Yes, there are 2 or 3. I think I'm not sure who was first, but if you'd like to go first.
Hi, thank you for the interesting consideration. Mine is more than a question, it's actually a consideration from my own experience. I work in investment banking for 20 years, and now I work or operate in the art market. And I have the impression that the art market is more gender discriminator than investment banking. And not because people are better or worse, but because investment banking or the large organizations are regulated. So some basic discrimination or some basic sexual harassment episode are not happening as much as they can happen in the art market. And also in terms of numbers, because if we look at how many are the share of men and women who study economics or business administration on one side, or who study art on the other, and how many women we have at the top, there is a big disparity which we need to close. And so the question is more, as more regulation in corporate world, I believe, can bring a bit less gender discrimination. Do you think we need more regulation in the art market?
I'd like to answer that. I think you've brought up a very interesting, very, very thorny question. I think one of the reasons that the corporate world tends to be ahead of the art world is because corporations are focused on generating profit, and they've realized how much talent there is out there which they haven't tapped into. And so they've realized that women and others who've been historically excluded actually can increase their profit if they allow them to be functional within a corporation. What you're talking about when you speak about regulation is similar to the idea of a quota. What would it mean for museums? I'm talking primarily here about public interests and public institutions, what would it mean for them if not to enforce an actual quota, to think in terms of generating decisions based on what our society actually looks like, based on the idea of the fact that a public institution is there to serve a public, and if the public that a museum is serving is not represented by the work that it shows and the work that it collects, then there's a failure, there's an ideological failure, and there's an institutional failure. And therefore, I think that although I very much doubt that we'll get to a point where quotas are instituted, I think that is a very useful idea for thinking about, a very interesting tool for thinking about. As a South African, I'm particularly in favor of thinking about quotas, because I know for sure that if the South African government had not instituted tools and mechanisms whereby wealth could slowly start to be redistributed and rethought across a greater range of South African citizens, there's no way that white capital and white corporations would simply, in 1994, when apartheid was officially dismantled, there's no way that people in power, whether it be white people in the situation in South Africa or white men in institutions, are going to wake up one morning and say, oh, we're just going to change all of this, we're just going to relinquish our power and our privilege. And that's why I think what you're saying is extremely interesting in terms of a strategy. What would some kind of regulation, formal and enforceable or otherwise, I like to think of it in terms of a pressure lobby. I think we can exercise a pressure lobby, and I think that what we're doing here, this panel, is a tool, it's an instrument, and it's applying pressure which is not tangible and which is not visible, because it's a tiny node in a network of pressure and lobbying which we are sharing now towards the ends of some kind of regulatory thinking, which may or may not turn into procedure or enforced practice, but we need to somehow communally, across a range of shared interests, think about how we can arrive at an image which more truly represents the publics that are being served by these kinds of institutions or markets, for that matter.
I think that's, yeah, that was a great point you brought up. Another question here. I think we've got time for one more, I hope. Yes, we have.
Thank you so much. You mentioned earlier the Baltimore Museum as being an example of one that's taking radical steps to improve representation, and I know MoMA in New York is also shutting down this summer to do a similar move to introduce more artworks by women and people of color. Are there any other institutions that you can think of or name that have taken concrete steps like this to improve representation in their artworks?
Do you know?
Well, I mean, the Tate is certainly doing it.
There's been a very big change at the Tate since it appointed a female director.
Mm-hmm. Point made.
because we've seen a big change in shows, but also acquisitions, I think. Yeah. Other institutions, I actually think that the... Sorry? Yes. Do you want a mic?
Around 15 years ago, this has to be mentioned because it was early on, before we were becoming fashionable women. The Van Abbe Museum started a great research, thanks to Charles Zesch, the director, I don't know if he's still there, who pointed out the lack of women in collections, and he invited Lili van der Stoker, a Dutch artist, feminist, to have a permanent room for a few years that she decorated with her wall paint, with a pattern that she's typically using wall painting, and where she was inviting female artists to show inside a room that would have been purchased by the museum. So this was an early experiment that everybody very little people know about. But that was not only, but there's an incredible research that has been done by the museum that everybody can find on the website, where numbers and details of how much museums are not collecting women have been stated and researched very deeply. So.
Well, I'm glad that research exists because it's very important. And I think that the pressure lobby is already working. I really do. I think we can see it everywhere. I think people are now... I think the Venice Biennale this year was very noticeable. I mean, Candice, you represented South Africa in 2017, didn't you? And I don't know if you were there this time. Did you see a difference, do you think, in the number of women? Or not
I
so
haven't
much?
been to Venice yet, so
Okay.
I've heard people say what you've just said, but I haven't experienced it for myself. And we need to carry on celebrating those examples which break the mold, but we also need to remain conscious of how many institutions aren't shifting their practices at all. I mean, because we're in the context of Art Basel, maybe I'll pick up on something that Susanne said, which is that women haven't had that much access historically to dispensable income and to capital. And I have great hope as women start to have more expendable income and therefore the potential that they may develop an interest in collecting. I have a hope that women collectors will start to be more present. I went through a little exercise this morning when I was mentally preparing for this talk, looking at who's collected my work over the years, because I have an inventory of my collectors, and there are a couple of hundred of them at this point, although I have sold more of my work to museums than to private collections. And I could only count 8 women collectors who've collected my work over the last 25 years. Of course, there are many women who have co-collected my work with their partners, with their husbands, but there have only been 8 women over 25 years who have acquired my work, and I don't say that as criticism. I think it very much reflects who has access to income and who collects. I'm happy to say that Valeria may have been the first, or certainly one of the first people to add my work to her collection, which I was very grateful for at the time. But I think that I like the way that Susanne has connected this conversation to much broader systemic problems. We in the art world like to think of ourselves as champion bearers of liberal and progressive ideas, but it's absolutely true, as someone in the audience said a few moments ago, that there are several fields which we tend to look at as being more conservative from the perspective of the cultural world, which have been much more hands-on and much more proactive in addressing and looking for ways forward to remedy these kinds of disparities.
I'm afraid we really are running out of time. You picked up your mic. Did you want to have a last very quick word?
Well, I mean, it's been a journey, an incredible journey for 20 years, and I see also myself things shifting a little bit. But we don't want to become a fashion. We don't want to become a trend, and that's what we are really concerned about, that people then go back to the old ways. It's very difficult to eradicate the old ways of doing it and the old people in power. So it's for the benefit of everybody. We want to represent everybody, and it's all, as a collector, I'm so proud of having had the chance and the opportunity to do it for so long, but I felt lonely for a long time, and I felt sarcasm around me, and I felt resistance from galleries as well, and who is your friend, who is not, without exactly who sustains you and supports you, who does not, without any words. So we know exactly who they are, and so now I feel still a little bit alone, because I see a lot of noise, about female artists and also other cultures and all sorts of gender, because it's not just binary. But really, I feel alone. I don't feel that we still have serious commitment and serious understanding of how much value and how much quality we are missing, and how much quality is there that is not white men.
Well, I think that's a pretty brilliant note to end on. I hope you'll agree with me that this has been amazing and really inspiring, and please join me in thanking this incredible panel, Susanne, Candice and Valeria.